This is an interview with Philip Kitcher, a philosopher of science known for connecting how scientific knowledge grows with democratic and ethical questions that shape public life. He studied mathematics at Cambridge before moving into the history and philosophy of science at Princeton University. He is also the author of the books including Abusing Science and The Rich and the Poor. You can read more about Philip Kitcher on our website, 6degrees.blog, as well as our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you so much and enjoy the interview.
What drew you from studying mathematics at Cambridge into the history and philosophy of science at Princeton? And how did that change the kinds of problems you felt were worth devoting your career to?
I in my second year at Cambridge, I had a super. I was went to a supervision with my one of the mathematics tutors at Christ College, Cambridge, and my supervisor greeted me with by saying, "Look, you're obviously getting progressively less interested in mathematics. If you go on like this, you will end up like me. I'm only in Cambridge for the music," he said. And in fact, he went on to have a second career as a musicologist. I mean, even though he continued to teach mathematics, he had a second career as a musicologist, writing about particular things in the history of music that interested him. He became quite famous for this. Anyway, it was good advice, and he sent me off to see a friend of his who was a historian of science, a historian of astronomy, actually. And so I decided in my third year at Cambridge that I would do the 1 year course in history and philosophy of science, thinking I would do the history of science. But in fact, I then read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and that made me more interested in philosophy. And then I got a fellowship to go to the United States and decided, everybody advised me to do this, that I should go to Princeton, to the HBS program at Princeton. And so that's what I did. And I knew nothing. I was so utterly ignorant when I arrived, but I was interested in problems about science and the growth of scientific knowledge. And those seem to me much more fascinating than any problem I could um, reasonably think that I might deal with as a mathematician. I mean, Cambridge gave me, in some ways, a marvelous education in mathematics because I learned how to solve all kinds of recondite mathematical problems. But what it didn't do was give me a sense of what was mathematically important and, where you could find a good problem to work on. I had none of that. So I felt I would not ever do any creative work in mathematics that I was, and, uh, and the history and philosophy of science seemed to offer me a much greater field for opportunities of that sort.
Building on that move, how did working with Thomas Kuhn and Carl Hempel shape your early standards for good explanation and evidence, and the way you thought scientific fields actually develop?
Well, of course, in those days, Carl Hempel, he was always called Peter Hempel at Princeton, um, was the dean of the philosophers of science. He was the most influential figure in the field, and he was an absolutely wonderful human being as well as being a marvelously clear teacher. And he gave me a real sense of what it is to understand something very clearly and to work on it in a rigorous way. And Tom Kuhn at that stage had become very fed up with philosophy because he'd had a really rather awkward seminar the semester before I arrived in Princeton. The Princeton Young Turks had sort of given him a very, very hard time, and he vowed at that point that he would never teach another course in the Princeton philosophy department, which was a bit of a disappointment for me. But I still learned a lot from him on how to think about the history of science, and I benefited from his reactions to my doctoral dissertation as well.
Staying with your formation, how did your foray in biology, sparked by students' questions and a year embedded at Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, broaden your methods and your sense of what philosophy of science should try to accomplish?
Well, there I was, doing the sort of philosophy of science that I'd taught at Princeton, which had nothing to do with biology whatsoever, teaching students in philosophy of science. And then one day along comes a student to my office hours and says, you know, most of the students you have in your class are biology majors. We all want to become doctors. We're pre-med students. Couldn't you give us some examples from biology? Why does it always have to be physics with an occasional foray into chemistry? And I realized that that was a very, very good criticism of what I'd been doing, and that I better try to find something out about biology. I had no knowledge of biology whatsoever. So I went to the library and found a book called Philosophy of Biological Science. This field was just developing, and David Hull had produced, the first real textbook in it. And I took it away and I started to read it, and I said to myself, "This is utterly fascinating." And of course, having become fascinated by it, I felt I had to do some serious study. So I was teaching at the University of Vermont. I had colleagues in the biology department who were immensely helpful to me, but still I felt that I really needed to have a deeper understanding. So on my first sabbatical, I got a grant to go to the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology and hang out with the graduate students and the postdocs and with people like Richard Lewontin and Ernst Mayr and Stephen Jay Gould. And that was absolutely wonderful. It was an extraordinary experience, and I absorbed a lot. It was just, it was a 1 year crash course in all sorts of issues in biology.
Continuing from those experiences, why do you think cross-disciplinary lines is not just useful for necessary, but necessary for philosophical inquiry today? And how did that conviction take root in your early career?
Well, I'd always been somebody, I mean, from the very beginning, I was interested in doing cross-disciplinary work. I wanted my approach to philosophical questions to be attentive to history. I took that to be one of the principal messages of Kuhn's great book. And so I'd always wanted a certain kind of interdisciplinarity. But as I went on, my thesis was really on the sort of the historical evolution of mathematics, and that taught me how to think about philosophical questions as emerging from a history, and to try to understand those questions by seeing how they had come to seem significant to people. And that quickly convinced me that one needed to know quite a lot about quite a large number of things in order to have a deep philosophical understanding of any particular issue. And that's been that, I mean, this was, I mean, this began in my graduate student days, and it led me to be very attentive to trying to put lots of different kinds of things together. And as I went on, I came to realize that the philosophers I esteemed most, the great philosophers, had been people of immensely wide learning, people whose contributions often consisted not in the sorts of developing some sort of clever argument about something, but in seeing how a variety of things fitted together in a new way. So I came to think that the task of philosophy is actually not necessarily to argue for a particular kind of conclusion, but to suggest new ways of looking at things. And I think that's what the great philosophers have always given us. And they've done it by what I like to call synthetic philosophy. And that seems to me just terribly important. And I think that the philosophy profession today, while it is enormously good at inculcating rigorous analytic skills of teasing apart arguments and understanding things, which are very, very useful to all sorts of people in all sorts of areas of life, isn't anywhere near so good at discharging what I take to be the central task of philosophy, which is trying to understand how many different kinds of things fit together. I mean, philosophers don't, on my view, have any special sort of esoteric understanding of some area of knowledge. What we do is try to take all the various areas of knowledge and all the domains of human existence and all the variety with which people live. It's the people who move among various fields and various aspects of life and try to understand, try to construct a larger picture.
Moving from training to public engagement, what made the creation evolution conflict feel like the right first arena and led you to write Abusing Science? In what philosophical
Ah,
space?
yes. Well, let me get one thing straight. Abusing Science was the first book of mine that got published, but in fact, it was not the first one that was written. The one I wrote first was a book on mathematics that came out of my doctoral dissertation, and this took me a long time to write it. I think it always takes people when they write their first book much longer than subsequent books will take. You have to learn how to write a book. Anyway, um, I finished this and finished this book, and it was sent off to Oxford University Press, and it was accepted. But it was on a standard, routine kind of publication schedule. So while that was, as it were, going through the pre-publication thing with Oxford, um, I had gotten very interested in evolutionary biology, and I'd gotten very interested in the evolution creation controversy, and that came about as my original interest in biology came about, just as a matter of serendipity, of luck, just as a student had come into my office and asked me a question. So I got sick. I got the flu. And there I was sitting in front of the TV feeling dreadful and looking for something that might possibly take my mind off my symptoms for a few hours. And I flipped through TV Guide. You're too young to know about TV Guide, but in the days before, menus would come up on the screen, we had this sort of publication that appeared every week called TV Guide. Anyway, so as I was flipping through, I found an advertisement for a book, and it was called The Remarkable Birth of Planet Earth, and you could get it free by writing to some place. So I decided I'd write off and get it. And of course, it was a creationist book, and it came, and I read it. I was feeling better by this time, and I realized that most of the people I knew would be unable to answer the challenges to evolutionary theory that were posed in this book. So I thought, yeah, people should learn about this. So I started giving talks, and then some friends who actually had set up a publishing press came to Burlington, Vermont, and they took my wife and me out to lunch. And when I told them what I was doing, they said, "Oh, you have to write a book about this." And so before I knew it, I had a contract from MIT Press to write a book about the creation evolution controversy. And then they wanted it really quickly, so I wrote it really quickly with a lot of help from my wife, and it became Abusing Science. And uh, I wouldn't write it that way, I think, these days, but it was a sort of it was a little bit too uncharitable, I think, to creation scientists as people, though not to them as thinkers, but to them as people. It was a bit, mean actually, but in any case, so I wrote it, and it got published, and it did quite well.
Following that controversy, what did engaging creationism teach you about how scientific reasoning meets public belief, education, and the recurring misuse of philosophical ideas?
You know, I didn't really reflect as much as I should have done on the way in which science integrates with the public. I mean, I was a guy with a mission, right? My mission was to lay it out there for the general public so that, this creationist nonsense didn't sort of win more allegiance than it was already doing. So my task was just, as it were, to take a big hammer and bash creation science with it as frequently and as hard as possible. Now, as I went on, I also wrote a book which was much more sophisticated and difficult, and but had very much the same spirit about the limits of the movement to try to explain human behavior in biological terms, the sociobiology controversy. And that's a much more sophisticated book, and it's a much more um, I think it's a much more important book than the creationism book. And at that stage, I was beginning to worry about the relations between science and the broader culture and science and politics. And as a result of having done these two things, I was invited then to write about the Human Genome Project, which was developing in the early 1990s. The Library of Congress sent me an invitation to be a senior fellow at the Library of Congress for a year and to write them a report about the implications of genomic research. I had to tell them, what should be worried about and what was great about it, and etc., what was likely to come of it. I traveled around the country a fair bit that year, interviewing prominent genomic scientists who were incredibly welcoming and generous to me. They were they were very open, and I think they quickly there was a kind of gossip network. And I went to one place. I can't remember where I went first, but by the time I got to the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh places, I mean, it was quite clear that people had been told, you can talk to this guy, he's all right, And so they were really helpful, and I wrote a report, and then I wrote a book on it. But it was that experience actually going from time to Washington as I did. I couldn't live in Washington. I couldn't be away for the whole year. We had young children, but going to Washington periodically and giving reports to congressional staffers and talking to people, I came to realize that there is this sort of channel of transmission that goes from the research laboratory to the general public and to science policy as well. And this was very important and completely neglected by philosophers. So there was no serious conception or no serious investigation by philosophers of how science might relate to the public good. And that just turned my thinking completely. Now, I might have seen that already had I really thought about it hard when I was writing about creationism or about sociobiology. And I think there were inklings of it when I was writing about sociobiology, but it really came home to me in a big way when I was writing on the Genome Project. And that then turned me in new directions that have led to all sorts of things that I've done since. I mean, I could have gone on writing about science from, the mid 90s to now, but much of my work after the 1990s has been devoted to issues about ethics and politics and education that arise directly out of the reflections that I had while I was trying to figure out how to talk about the implications of the Human Genome Project.
Turning to sociobiology, what was your central objection in vaulting ambition to extrapolating from insect societies to human nature, especially given the complexity and variability of human cultures and environments?
Well, I mean, there are two kinds of objections. One objection is that I found considerable fault with the mathematical models. It's here that my mathematical training really, really, really helped. Because when I started to look into the mathematics of the modeling, I realized that there were all sorts of things that were being taken for granted. You know, that the model has to look like this. And I would come along and I would say, no, it doesn't, because you could look at it this way. You could construct a model that is, on the face of it, more accurate and more representative of what human beings do than the one that you're using. So that was a kind of consistent technical objection that I had. But there was also a main line of objection to the thought that you can just throw away as it were, the environmental, the socio-cultural aspects here. That you can take a social insect in a very different kind of society with a very much more limited set of interactions with that society, and you can extrapolate what goes on there to a more sophisticated animal group, and you can extrapolate that to human beings. And what I wanted to say again and again and again is that what you've got here are environmental effects, and the environments are much more complicated in the human case. And that has been borne out. It was one of the most important chapters in the book I wrote was aimed to show that any conception that showed the dominance of genetics was in fact flawed, or the arguments for it were flawed. There is genuine sort of gene culture coevolution. And shortly after that, theories of gene culture evolution got really worked out in the work of uh, Peter Richardson and Robert Boyd, and ever since, I think people have realized this, although even today, I think it's neglected by many evolutionary psychologists who have, in some ways, inherited many of the mistakes that I tried to diagnose. Not all of them, by any means, but a fair majority of them are still in the grip of assumptions that my book tried to debunk. Fortunately, a former graduate student of mine, Chris Halfer, has a forthcoming book that identifies the ways in which current programs in evolutionary psychology often fall short. And I hope that that will have the same impact that my book and the book that Dick Lewontin, Leon Kamin, and Stephen Rose wrote, Not in Our Genes, had in the mid-80s. I mean, one thing about the sociobiology controversy is that as the result of two books, one Lewontin, Kamin, and Rose's book, and the other being my book, those two books essentially said, hey, wait a minute, and people listened. There was a real backing off from the original sociobiological program. And then it seems to me to have emerged later on in the 80s in a quite healthy series of investigations in evolutionary anthropology, and a much less healthy set of applications in evolutionary psychology.
As a consequence of that biological engagement, how did sustained reading across genetic behavior and ecology refine your standards for what counts as a robust scientific explanation?
Um, what it eventually convinced me of was that no and my current thinking, and this really reflects the kind of engagement that I've had with the various science throughout my context of theories of explanation. Hempel said, look, we need a general theory of scientific explanation. Explanations produce understanding, and what we want to know is how they work. And he had a famous proposal which became very influential in philosophy for quite a long time before people discovered various defects in it. And ever since, there have been competing models of general scientific education. So gradually it dawned in on me that there isn't such a thing as a general model for scientific explanation. The scientific explanations are highly diverse. I mean, I'd proposed my own model. I'd been part of this controversy, but it's that Hempel had made a fundamental mistake at the very beginning by thinking in terms of a general model here. But then I also realized something else as I went on, that thinking about this, you know, explanations produce understanding. It has a sort of ring to it, or it has a kind of picture built into it that, now you've got this person who's really confused. And then that person is given the explanation, and now they're in a state of clarity and understanding. Well, that itself is a bit peculiar. And it's a bit peculiar because we're never in a state of perfect understanding. What happens in an explanation is that it's triggered, I think, by a particular kind of confusion or misunderstanding, or a sense that we don't have a clue what's going on. And what we get from an explanation is clearing up the misunderstanding. Or sometimes, if all you want is a clue about what's going on, a start on, as it were, conceptualizing what's happening, seeing something of what's going on. So I would now say that the right way to think about this is in terms of, a multiplicity of ways in which people can be confused, mistaken, not getting it about all sorts of things. And explanations come in and they sort of, as it were, hone in on a particular kind of confusion. And that then, if you have that picture, then of course explanations are going to be highly diverse. They're going to be very different. And it's folly to seek a general model. So that was really what happened as I tried to think through how explanations worked in not only in biology but in other sciences too.
Shifting to questions of objectivity, how do you now describe the real pattern by which science advances beyond the simple legend of linear accumulation, while still steering clear of relativism?
Um, I think at the moment that my views. I have a book that I've been writing really for virtually all this century, which is, it's partially finished, but there are bits and pieces that I want to add to it, which is really about the idea of objectivity. And it involves a different way of thinking about knowledge. So the way I think about knowledge is there's something that stimulates a particular kind of inquiry. We want to find the answer to a particular kind of question, often because answering that question is relevant to things we do. We find ourselves blocked in helps us clear away those obstacles. Okay, now what happens? Well, we look for such a thing, and eventually we find something that seems to work for that and possibly may work for other cases too. It's not just restricted. And so we start, you know, putting it on the books as one might say, as something that can be that may be it, but then we go on and we find out that it can be relied on across a wider set of context. And then it becomes something that gets written down, that becomes part of the law of a particular community. And that community may be some field of science, or it may be people who are involved in cooking things. It may be involved in gardening. It may be involved in telling jokes. It may be it can all. I mean, inquiry is very various. I mean, people think of knowledge always in terms of, well, I'm finding out about the world, but that's only one kind of investigation. We also investigate, what's worthwhile, what's useful and valuable for people to do. So there's ethical inquiry as well. There's religious inquiry. There's all sorts of forms of inquiry, political inquiry. And what we're always looking at is something that is reliable, and so we inscribe these things, and then we trust them for a while, and sometimes we find they have to be refined and changed. Sometimes we find they have to be thrown out altogether and completely reconceptualized. That was what Kuhn was after in the structure of scientific revolutions. And so you've got this ongoing march, and the objectivity is, in a way, the objectivity that comes from finding a key that opens a door. That's the way I think about objectivity in the main. There's something that we want to get done, and we can't find a way to get it done, and then we find a way to get it done, and then we think about extending that particular solution to a range of cases, and the objectivity consists in the fact that we can, as it were, turn this key and keep opening all sorts of doors. The key fits the lock.
How would a well-ordered approach actually set day-to-day priorities in universities and agencies, from agenda setting and evaluation to accountability for social benefit?
Okay, so now you're talking about the way in which I first conceived the relationship between science and the public.
Mhm.
Because I came to see, when I was doing my work on the Genome Project, I came to see the ways in which it would be very easy for particular fields of science to drift away from concerns to a larger group of people. So I came to appreciate the importance of some kind of mechanism that would focus scientific research on the things that people wanted to know, science contributing to the common good. And so my thought here was that this should be pursued democratically, that one should try to represent the interests of everybody. And by everybody, that might even include people who were not yet born, as indeed I think is very important to recognize in the case of climate change. So the thought is that scientific problems gain their importance because if people sat down with one another and pooled all their different perspectives in light of the best available information, they would agree that a particular kind of question was a significant one to answer. And of course, these questions sometimes will need all sorts of very technical and erudite investigations before you can get to the question that you really want to answer. You have to do immense amounts of basic science. That ought to be completely clear from the very beginning. The history of science is full of examples of programs that required an enormous amount of preliminary work and asking basic questions in order to get to the answers that people really wanted. Think of contemporary biomedicine. It basically took, the better part of a century to get to some sophisticated molecular biomedicine, starting with the rediscovery of Mendelian genetics at the very beginning of the 20th century. That route went through thinking about fruit flies, thinking about yeast, thinking about E. coli, thinking about all sorts of genetic systems in all sorts of organisms, before at the very end we could launch projects like the Human Genome Project that would open up molecular medicine. That was immensely important, but the route had to be indirect. So, in the clear understanding that you may need a very long and circuitous route, what you do is you try to get something that, as it were, answers concerns that are widely shared, when people really understand their own needs and those of others. So this, of course, led me straight into the territory of ethics and political philosophy. And that has occupied me a great deal since. At that stage, I really did have to do some quite serious work on thinking, giving my own answer to questions about what is good, what is right, and so forth. And given my evolutionary background and my historical emphasis, I wanted to approach those questions by going back to history, and in fact to deep history, and trying to understand ethical life in those terms.
Pivoting to American pragmatism, what did you find in John Dewey that clarified your own emerging views about truth, democracy, and education? And how has that guidance endured across your work?
So this is, I'm going to tell a story I've told a number of times before. So when I came to Columbia in 1999, I had known Sidney Morgan Besser, the famous witty philosopher, brilliant man, truly brilliant man. I'd known him since the late 70s and early 80s, and he'd always struck me as somebody who was immensely kind to me, even though he had this reputation of being incredibly fierce as a critic. But he's always very nice to me. Anyway, so I came and I discovered that he was confined to his apartment, and my friend and colleague, Isaac Levi, senior colleague, said, why don't you come over and visit Sidney? I think he'd like to talk to you. So I did, and I went over and I talked to Sidney, and I had wonderful conversations, and I came out with a spring in my step every time. I'd go to see him once a week, and we would chat about all sorts of things for a couple of hours. And in the course of one of these conversations, I'd given Sidney my book, Science, Truth and Democracy. I came in and Sidney said to me, you sound just like Dewey. You ever read any Dewey? I said, no, it's completely impossible to understand. You start with these banal sentences that go on and on and on, and 4 pages in, you haven't got a clue what he's saying. So Sidney said to me, you've got to read The Quest for Certainty. So I did. And I was amazed because I discovered that Dewey had been working towards all kinds of things that I had struggled to come to in the course of my philosophical career. So, what I did was realize that I would never have found those things in Dewey if I hadn't found, if I hadn't, as it were, partially at least worked them out myself. And so my reading Dewey has always been a conversation between Dewey and me. I have ideas that are going in the same direction as Dewey, and he can help me because he also wants to go in the same direction. And I would never have realized that but for this conversation with Sydney. I mean, it was eye-opening. And I mean, I think what I tend to do is, I mean, I've read Dewey's works quite systematically. I have a huge notebook full of notes about various passages, and someday I may write something on themes in Dewey. But he is, for me, someone who can suggest ways of going on along a path that I want to go, and that's been, that's really been quite important to me in the last 20 years.
Keeping pragmatism in view, how do you reconcile a pragmatist emphasis on successful problem solving with talk of objective truth in science? What you've sometimes called a pragmatic realism that avoids both absolutism and relativism.
Okay, well, I think it's actually implicit there in what I said earlier about the lock and key objectivity. Because what I gave was actually an incredibly sort of straightforward, pragmatist account of knowledge. You know, you get something that works, and then you try to generalize it. You try to see where it works, where it breaks down. It comes to have a particular place in your repertoire of thinking about things and acting. And what you do is you go with it, try to refine it, and try to break it, until it breaks down. And then you try to revise, you try to find something else that will have the same kind of success on a larger scale. And that's the way knowledge grows. Okay, now if you think about it, then it's not just, not just, I mean, we've got this sort of old-fashioned idea, and I think it's a perfectly good idea, that something will only work if it somehow gets to grips with the way things are independent of us. We can't just make it all up and expect to be successful. We've got to attend to the ways in which reality pushes back against us. So I think what I think of is, and I've called this the natural epistemological attitude, that, when we've got something that is working fairly successfully, we tend to think that we're on to something about an independent world. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to believe. And then people come along and say, well, science is always changing, people take things back, and so on and so forth. So why should you have any trust in what you're now doing? And my answer to that is, look, it's a good bet. If I bet on the continued reliability of this particular technique, what the history of science tells me is this. Well, maybe it will go on working for a very long time, possibly forever, in which case you win. Or maybe in trying to make it work, you'll discover that there are cases in which it doesn't work. Well, heads you win, tails you win. What's wrong with that? It's a really good bet. So I think that's the right pragmatist answer. So there's a kind of realism that I think is perfectly defensible. It's thoroughly pragmatic, and it recognizes what's really been great, not just about scientific inquiry, but about other forms of inquiry too, that we can make progress by trusting the things that seem to work, because sometimes they'll just go on working, and sometimes when they don't go on working, we can figure out how to make them better. It's very rare that we lose in this. We always, as it were, retain the set of cases where we can make it work. So we're never worse off, but typically we end up better off. Good deal, I think.
Your new book, The Rich and the Poor, presses the reinsert ethics into public policy and to organize collective deliberation around poverty and inequality. How does that project connect with your long-standing themes about democratic guidance of science, moral progress, and the practical uses of philosophy? And what near-term changes would you most want to see?
Okay, well, look, I mean, that's about five different questions all wrapped up into one. So, I told you that having, written Science, Truth, and Democracy, I really had to do some serious ethical and political philosophical work. That's right. So, what I then tried to do was understand how our ethics might have evolved. Now, the first thing to realize is that people have been engaged in some form of ethical life for a very, very, very long time. It's not just that there are lots of ethical conceptions and rules already in the earliest written documents to have survived. It's not just that. I mean, we now know that there was trade 25,000 years ago. I mean, if bands are trading with one another, they've got to have a system of, they've got to have an agreed on system of rules. And those kinds of rules will only come if there's been a previous stage at which individual groups have worked out rules for their conduct. So at a guess, I would say, I mean, this is, I think, a pretty informed guess, that ethical life is 50,000 to 100,000 years old. That's probably the time when language emerged fully in that period. So what we've got is, I think, the coevolution of our ability to talk with one another and our ethical life. Now, I can say quite a lot about the primatological considerations that move me to think that, we do have this ability to figure out ways in which we can make our interactions with one another work better. But I'm not, I mean, I could go on about that for a long time, but it does seem that not only human beings, but also our closest evolutionary relatives have the ability to detect one another's thoughts, feelings, intentions, plans, and so forth, but also to respond to them in positive ways so that the animals in question help one another. The problem is that in our evolutionary relatives, that happens across a relatively narrow range of circumstances. What ethics does for us is radically to expand that set of circumstances, to give us rules to follow, even when we aren't prepared by our sort of evolved dispositions to help one another, to do it, not to get into fights, but to cooperate together. That's because we have this underlying psychological disposition, which is limited, but can be amplified by ethical rules. And that's been going on, I think, for, as I said, between 50,000 and 100,000 years. And now, when I think about the ways in which, in actual human history that we can trace, the ways in which moral advances have occurred, they occur because people are able to recognize one another's intentions and to respond to them where they didn't before. That's happened in the case of the abolition of slavery, that's happened in the case of the expansion of opportunities for women, and it's happened in my lifetime with respect to people who love members of their own sex. We've gotten beyond those awful prejudices, that women can't do things, that slaves are inferior, that gays and lesbians are sinful and, destined for damnation. I mean, we're beyond that, I hope. Although these achievements are never perfect and they're never complete. Anyway, How has that happened? Well, it's happened through the ability to get inside another individual's life, to see it from a different way. That's why I think a certain kind of discussion is absolutely essential to ethical life. It's a discussion in which you come to learn how another person whom you think of as completely misguided about something thinks about the world and why. And on that basis, you try to figure out together how you can work with that other person or with other people, because there may be many different perspectives on this. So that's led me to the thought of an ethical method which involves a certain kind of conversation. The conversation should be as inclusive as possible. That is, it should try to represent the views of people who are affected in different ways by the issue at hand. It should also be as well informed as possible, use the best, most reliable, I would say, available information. And it's got to, above all, it's got to be based on a kind of mutual understanding. I get inside your head. I get to feel the world in the way that you feel it. To be frightened of the thing, I get to understand the things you're frightened of, the things that you're trying to do. And we then try to coordinate and find a way of satisfying all of us. Not ideal, possibly, for any of us, but something that we can all live with together. And that's the stuff of which ethical life, I think, is being composed. And you can see it in the activities of the people who live most, in the way most like our remote ancestors did. So the hunter-gatherers who still survive have these very sort of close and tightly knit societies in which they do talk to one another. They do try to figure out how to overcome their troubles in much the way that I'm suggesting. So I think of ethical inquiry as this great amplifier. It takes something that our evolutionary relatives, our evolutionary ancestors could do, and it finds a way to amplify the behavior that generates. And that's absolutely important. So when you remove the idea of thinking about what's good and what's good for everybody, and trying to figure out ways of involving everybody in a democratic conversation and responding to everybody's needs, when you get rid of that in the name of economic efficiency, you're turning your back on what has made human progress possible. And what you end up with is a disaster. And as the book goes on to suggest, the disaster is particularly evident in the case of climate change, although I would say that it's now evident all over American society, all over the most other affluent societies, and has always been obvious in societies that are not particularly affluent. So there is, I have to say, a certain evangelism about my latest book. I mean, I feel a bit like, a voice crying in the wilderness saying, for God's sake, do something a bit different. And that is, it is rooted in a conception that traces all the way back to my attempts to understand how science relates to society. But it goes vastly beyond them, of course. So, I've given you just the most sort of cursory sketch of a range of ideas that I've basically been trying to articulate during the last 20 years. They've led me into education and thinking about how the moral education of children should go. They've led me into conceptions of society that will make human life fulfilling human life more available for a wider group of people. All of this is very much in the spirit of themes in Dewey, I may say. So there's a sense in which, it's at this point that everything comes together. And you see all the things that have been moving me for the last how many years? Maybe 50 odd years. And um, there's a view there, and I think it's it's a view that is, and I hope the book says it in a way that makes it possible to understand.
And how do you think people should navigate climate change today?
I think what we have to do is, I think we have to do two things. I think we have to realize that, first of all, that very serious measures needed to ward off the effects. I mean, it's clear to me that our descendants are going to a harsher environment than we currently live in. Unless we get really lucky, I mean, it's possible that there could be some terrific device that's developed for sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere on a very, very big scale. Be done. Not this is we can just leave it to the technologists to do it. Okay, so they're going to be harsh. We're going to have to do a lot of work to make them um, how shall I put it, acceptably harsh, harsher than what we have now, but manageable. That's going to require a lot of changes. We're going to have to and now we have to realize two things. One thing is that many human societies that are going to experience these harsh environments first are not in any position to take on what's needed by themselves. And secondly, that within the societies that are in such a position, there's a significant subpopulation. It's, I would say, perhaps about half the population of those societies, and it's going to grow as jobs, various kinds of jobs become less available. If AI starts to replace ever more human workers, we're going to have ever more unequal societies, and ever more people are going to be in the position of being threatened by climate action. I think resistance to action on climate change is largely fueled, of course, it's largely fueled by a few very wealthy people who want to continue getting vast profits and make themselves obscenely rich, and who seem to delight in doing things not because they are able to purchase things, but because they can flaunt their wealth to the world. Anyway, but put those people on one side. There are also masses of people in the United States, in Britain, in almost every country, possibly with the exceptions of a few Nordic countries. Other societies have this massive population of people who say, my life is hard enough already. If you impose climate action on me, it'll get even worse. My kids will have no chance whatsoever, etc., etc., etc. So without a more egalitarian society within human societies and across human societies, we won't get the necessary cooperation that we need, and the future will be very hard indeed. I'm not happy about this. I'm in fact profoundly unhappy. And I campaign as vigorously as I can for attention to this problem and attention to its root causes. And I think the root causes have come in the turn to economic efficiency and away from what one might have thought of as economics with public goods. I date this to the 70s and early 80s. and it's closely associated with a particular group of economists who became very influential, and in the United States with Ronald Reagan, and in Britain with Margaret Thatcher. And what happened thereafter was the deification of the idea of economic efficiency. So we don't ask anymore, what should we do to make the poor better off? We don't ask anymore, what should we do to make the planet habitable in the future? We don't ask 100 other questions about how to improve the lives of all sorts of people who don't have any serious opportunities for rewarding careers, satisfying lives of any kind. We don't ask those questions because basically we've given up on ethics. Instead, the question is, how do I make the world, a more egalitarian place? How do I make it possible for people who haven't yet enjoyed the benefits of the affluent world to come closer to enjoying those? Instead, it's just, how do I get ahead? How do I make sure that my country is as rich as possible? How do I maximize my profits? I mean, that's the wrong question. It's just the wrong question.
And how do you think AI will affect quality of life and um, other things like that from an ethical perspective?
Well, I'm here. I think one of the great figures in the history of philosophy is John Stuart Mill, and his thought, is that the only freedom worthy of the name is that of choosing our own good and pursuing it in our own way. Mill then goes slightly off the rails because he then says, as long as we don't interfere with other people in similar uh, pursuits. I would say that's the wrong way to continue the sentence. Provided other people in fostering all our pursuits. And it's that where the ethical moment comes in, because you can see in my continuation of the sentence that what is coming in is the idea of an exploration of all our perspectives and a search for a solution that is tolerable by all of us. So you can see that what I'm emphasizing again and again and again is a certain kind of ethical inquiry, and I think it's absolutely necessary to improve the quality of lives that people live, and I think it's necessary, therefore, for shaping the societies in which we live. So this is I mean, what I'm now saying strikes me as I hear myself saying it, absurdly ambitious, but it's a diagnosis of what is wrong and what would help make it right. I'm not a utopian. I don't think we'll ever get this perfectly right, but we can do it much better than we're doing it now. Of that, I'm convinced. And we can make the world a less disastrous place for our descendants to live in by following a particular strategy of trying to increase this. And that's why I wrote the book, and that's what the book is all about.
So I finish all of my interviews with the same question to all of my interviewees, and that is, how do you define success, both personally or professionally?
Um, I'll be successful to the extent that I have helped people think something, necessarily a large something, but something to the value of their lives. That if I've given them an idea or a thought or an approach that can make lives go better, then that's all I want. That's success for me.